The peculiarity of English children's stories. My name is Alan Macfarlane, and I'm a retired academic at the University of Cambridge. I've long been interested in children's stories. I've never tried to write them seriously, but I obviously read them myself as a child. And increasingly, as I look at some of the features of English culture, I see that English children's stories are very unusual. One should be wary of saying unique. They're different from even neighbouring countries. For example, the continental tradition in France and Germany and Italy and so on, or even the Celtic margins of the United Kingdom, Highland Scotland and Ireland, are very different. You find in the continental and Celtic traditions a great deal of the children's stories are to do with fairies, Grimm's fairy tales, Perrault and others, and there seem to be in these traditions parallel worlds in which children or adults suddenly encounter spirits, little creatures, often shown with wings and flying around and so on and so on. But they live in a parallel kingdom into which mortals stray. So fairy, sometimes spelt with an E, is a very important feature of continental traditions. When you look at English children's stories, I've been through a number of important books on English children's books and stories, and what's distinctive there is that there's hardly any, if any, fairy stories. Percy Muir says, well, I won't deal with any English ones, I'll talk about translations from the French. And if you look at other collections I have, like Andrew Lang's colour fairies, the pink and the blue, and the other books of fairy stories, the fairy stories he has in those collections are all from the continent or the Celtic areas. So one question is to do with an absence. Why are fairies and fairy stories of a traditional kind absent in this one part of Europe, whereas you will find them to a large extent in all over the rest of Europe, Celtic areas, and also in China and Japan and elsewhere. So that's a curious feature of them. The English tradition, in the absence of fairy stories, is very different. Let me first highlight some of the continental tradition, which I forgot to do. So you have Grimm's fairy tales, you have La Fontaine's children's stories and fairy tales, Hans Andersen's fairy tales, The Crock of Gold by James Stephens, and the colour books that I mentioned of Andrew Lang. Those are the continental and other traditions. When we turn to the English tradition, there are various types, and I think nearly all of them are very unusual. The first one is just where you have animals, no humans at all, or at least just occasionally a human turning up, but peripheral. And there are many wonderful examples in English children's stories. One is the series of books by Beatrix Potter at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, among them The Tale of Peter Rabbit and Squirrel Nutkin and the other animals that inhabit her world and enchant children, especially because of her wonderful illustrations. So those are animal stories. Often and always the animals behave like certain kinds of human beings, but they are just animal children's stories. Another delightful one is the stories by A. Milne, Winnie the Pooh. Piglet and Pooh and Eeyore and other characters who become legendary in English society. I, certainly in my generation, talk about people being like Tigger or being like Owl or whatever. And these are another set of human beings turned into little animals. And a third, also legendary, is Graham's The Wind in the Willows, where again characters like Ratty and Mole and the Toad of Toad Hall inhabit a parallel world by the riverside and in the woods, which I was read to and inhabited my mind from very early on. So there are those just animal stories, and I think you might well find examples of those elsewhere than England, but they are particularly rich and interesting in the English context. The next category is a human being with animals. So the tension is between a human, usually a child, because they're children's stories, in fact nearly always children, and animals of various kind. One of the iconic ones and the early ones is Alice and her adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. And here she encounters the Mad Hatter and the Dormouse and the Cheshire Cat and other animals, and the Red Queen, all sort of, Red Queens of course are playing cards, but they're all human-ish but have idiosyncratic characters which play off Alice's middle-class assumptions. Those are legendary and wonderful stories. I was brought up being brought up in India for my first few years on Rudyard Kipling and his Jungle Book, the Mowgli stories about a little boy who's brought up by wolves and then has adventures with the wolves and makes friends with various animals, bears and panthers and so on. And I absolutely loved these. And they were definitely, in Kipling's mind, moralistic. They were teaching you how to be a good, middle-class, resilient Englishman. And then leaping on a while to a recent one, which I was also very, very fond of, is The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And here you have a group of children who accidentally stumble through a wardrobe being a big, huge cupboard with some drawers at the bottom and at the top, a large amount of space for hanging coats and other things like that. And so they stumble into Narnia, a parallel world with a white witch and a lion and good and bad creatures, and there they have various adventures and come back out of their wardrobe. And it was so successful that Lewis Carroll wrote a sequence of other ones, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader and so on. So that's a second character where you're moving from just animals to animals with humans. Another characteristic or one is a parallel worlds of imagination and escape through sort of going into dream-like worlds. It's not always clear exactly how you enter them, but you move from this world to a parallel world, and there the children, it's usually children, in fact it's always children, again, have adventures. One early one, Victorian one, it was the book by Charles Kingsley, The Water Babies, and there a little chimney sweep in the north of England stumbles out of his life and becomes a water spirit. Another very iconic one is The Adventures of Peter Pan and Wendy. Peter Pan is a sort of fairy, but not exactly, and Tinkerbell certainly is a fairy, but just a marginal character. And this is about actually Peter Pan, of course, is not a fairy or anything else. Peter Pan's a little boy, and Wendy. They go, they are visited, have adventures, meeting Captain Cook and the pirates and so on. Very adventurous and exciting and amusing tales. A little later is one I enjoyed very much called The Secret Garden, and that's about something which touched me, which was about a little girl who's sent home from India and is very lonely and homesick and for India and so on. And then she stumbles into a secret garden, which is a parallel, and makes friends with people there. And then the last example is Terry Pratchett's Discworld series, which is not exactly in that genre, but it's a sort of science fiction, and it's half for adults and half for children. And there you have a completely made-up world with many, many different kinds of adventures, all balanced on turtles, which are balanced on elephants, and so on and so on. So that's another strand. Another strand, which is I was brought up on, are battles between good and evil. And there are two major forms of this. One are actual supposed historical characters, though they are hovering on the edge of myths. No one is sure whether they existed or not. The two that I played at as a child one was Robin Hood, the outlaw, and his merry men, and the second was King Arthur, the king of the Britons, fighting against evil enemies, leading the Knights of the Round Table on various great ventures and wars and in pursuit of the Holy Grail and so on. I absolutely loved both those, and so at the age of 8 or 9 I would pretend to be Arthur and his knights, or Arthur or Robin Hood or Alan a Dale or one of the characters in that book. Both those characters are semi-mythical, but all sorts of legends were woven around them, and these often are quite old legends, more or less a few hundred years after the supposed events. The other main kind of battle between good and evil is fantasy battles, and this is particularly strong and influential, and I loved them. When I was at Oxford, J.R. Tolkien was bringing out his masterly trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, and I read the 3 great volumes which have been made into wonderful films there, and as an adult I appreciated them. They're of course based on Norse and other mythologies, and they have a deep undertone of a Christian battle between good and evil. Another Oxford author much later was Philip Pullman, again in a trilogy, his Dark Materials, and these have also been made into successful films. And then to the younger generation now, the most famous of all perhaps are the series of novels by J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter series. And these, I know from talking to young people in China, are extremely popular there. And when I gave talk in Wuhan, for example, I was asked how many wizards there were in my village, because they'd all read Harry Potter and assumed I was surrounded by that world. So those are battles between good and evil, and there's always a demonic and evil character in each of them against whom the hero or heroine fights. Finally, there's playful stories of childhood. This is another genre which I like very much, and these are to do with children's adventures. That is, there's no fairies, there's no entering portals really. They are just ordinary children who have adventures in a sort of parallel reality, but not entirely. That is to say that they leave their boring lives of whatever they're doing in school and so on, and they go off and have adventures. And the ones that I read and are characteristic of this, one of them is a series by Arthur Ransom, who was also a spy, among other things, but he lived in the Lake District where I was living for some years, and even before I went there I started reading his series, starting with Swallows and Amazons, which is a set of adventures, 10 or 11 again, where 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, have various adventures. They go out to sea, or they climb mountains, or they have mock battles on Lake Windermere, or whatever it is. And I loved those, the Arthur Ransom stories. They somehow appealed to me. I also loved the books, the series on by Richmal Crompton, I had forgotten, the William series, Just William and others, where you have a gang, again a group, a gang of boys, William and Henry and the others, who are naughty. Basically, they are slightly rebellious. They're always playing tricks. William is a very recognizable character, a rather boastful leader whose plans often go astray. They fight against goody-goody gangs. They tease the girls in the stories, and they are at constant war with the adults. And so it appealed to our sort of adventurous, naughty nature as children. Another series are those by Roald Dahl, who was an adopted Englishman, educated here, and his books again have been successfully televised. There are many of them. One, for example, is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, or James and the Big Peach, and they're very believable characters, and they're fantasies. The Chocolate Factory is a fantasy that many children would have who love chocolate. And then something unclassifiable, really. Another one that I loved was Wurzel Gummidge, which is about a scarecrow that and 1 or 2 other scarecrows that come to life and with the children who are playing with it. So those are the kinds of children's stories that I grew up with. They're both as much for adults as for children, and they're unusual. I mean, in America you get obviously some stories similar, like Mark Twain, and that series are quite similar to Just William. But I don't know enough about American children's stories to know whether you get all these genres. But if you had to line up the top 50 children's story writers in the world, putting aside fairy stories, you would find that, 40 of them would be English, with a touch of Welshness and Scottishness perhaps, but basically English. So this raises the question, which I think is of wider significance: why are English children's stories so different? And anyone can have their own theories, but I have my theories which fit in with a project which I've been engaged in. What I've been trying to do over the last 15 years is to write an autobiography describing my life, and particularly my early life, my first 30 years. So I've written a number of books, 10 in fact, based on what I thought and what was thought about me at the time when I was growing up. I kept almost everything that I was sent or given, and I wrote myself from about the age of 15, and that included quite a lot from before that, my preparatory school work and letters and other materials. And people to whom I wrote, like my mother, every week, because she was in India and I was in England, every week I wrote and she wrote to me, and many of these letters survive, and they are the core of the account. But there are also many photographs, a little bit of artwork, diaries, all sorts of material. This helps me reconstruct my own move from infancy to childhood, to adolescence, to adulthood, the 4 stages. And I can chart it in a detail which I don't think any other academic I know of or writer has ever done. You get, obviously, famous autobiographical literature, many autobiographies, some long, some slender, some wonderful, some like Proust, internationally known, but none of them are like this, and I don't know of anyone who's written such a thing, whether it's because they don't have the material or because they're not interested or don't have the time or whatever. There are a number of reasons which we can explore, but there are no other series like this. I've talked to experts on Western and other literature. I'd be interested if someone could come up with another example, but so far the 10 thick volumes, large volumes, most of them, about stages in my life, are a source for understanding the transition from childhood to adulthood, which throws light on English children's stories. Because my story can be summarized very simply by looking at the wonderful autobiographical poem by William Wordsworth, The Prelude. Now, Wordsworth is close to me because he was brought up in and went to school in the valley where I moved at the age of 12. So in his most impressionable age, from 12 to 18, he was living where I was living and going skating on the tarns or little lakes which I went skating on, climbing the little mountains and crags that I was climbing. So I identified with Wordsworth and even went on a tour around Europe in his footsteps, which he describes in the prelude. So Wordsworth's central theme, of course, is the loss of childhood, the loss of innocence, the loss of security, the loss of magic, the loss of some kind of connectedness between humans and nature. We grow up surrounded by natural objects and we feel part of them, part of the trees and rocks and stones and animals and birds. And then gradually, as we grow up, our world becomes separated off. We are turned into rational adults. But as we do that, we lose a huge amount. We gain a huge amount, but we lose a huge amount. And his poetry, much of it, is about the sadness and sense of loss. It's a theme, of course, of much of the romantics of that time. You find it in Keats, you find it in Shelley, even Coleridge. The loss of a world which is not just childhood, but also it's the time of the Industrial Revolution and growth of cities. So it's the loss of a supposed agrarian, more integrated, more community-based world in the face of individualistic, rapid capitalist growth. So these two things come together, but certainly the loss of childhood innocence is the theme of Wordsworth's poetry, and it's the theme of a number of the volumes that I wrote. For example, my book on Lakeland life, which is the period when we moved to the Lake District until I left for university. That is that transition from a world of childhood toys and childhood sentiments to the beginnings of adult rationality, romantic love, separate thoughts and existence. And it was this that I found painful. I tried to remain a child as long as possible, I realize. Even until the age of 21, 22, I was reading as much children's literature. When I was preparing for my final examinations at Oxford, I went off into the nearby countryside and I read children's stories and books and myths and legends to refresh myself, and then came back and wrote my exams. And when I went on to do a PhD or a DPhil, I chose a subject which was exactly on this theme, the loss of something magical and enchanted, and that was on witchcraft in Tudor and Stuart England. And my supervisor then was writing his great book on exactly that theme, religion and the decline of magic. So this theme of the decline of a magical world that had existed before, either in childhood or before the Industrial Revolution, was our themes, his on a large scale, mine on a small scale. And it has remained a theme in my life. Much of my work has been about rationality, about individualism, about the Weberian themes of disenchantment of the world, about the iron cage of rationality, and so on. And so book after book has been around that, and recently I've tried to analyze it all and put it into one volume called Enchantment and Modernity, which has just been finished. So what do I mean by this kind of growing rationality? Well, I can, and modernity, which somehow seems to change the English from one thing to another. Well, let me just examine it briefly, because this is the background to the English tradition of children's stories and much else, if one's going to understand the difference between the English and other cultures. As an anthropologist, simplifying hugely, what I taught was that many societies, in fact all human beings, started as hunter-gatherers, very small bands of human beings who wandered around the world hunting, obviously, animals, and gathering nuts and fruits and things like that. There was no settled agriculture, there was no civilization, very simple organization, which you still found when I entered anthropology in certain parts of Africa or Australia, or a few forests, or up in the Arctic region, hunters and gatherers. That world is undivided. You don't have any instituted areas of life. You obviously don't have a police force or a legal system or a state or a formal religion or anything. Everything is joined together. A small group of African hunters and gatherers are a complete world in themselves, and each family and each individual is part of a complete world. No separations. You then have a period of tribalism, tribal societies, which are roughly the same. I worked in such a society in the Himalayas, in Nepal, and have studied them on the borders of Burma and Assam, the Nagas. And these are undivided worlds where the social, the economic, the political, and the ideological or religious are all lumped together, no separations. Then you get the great transformation, the next great transformation, which is towards civilizations. Civilizations meaning societies which are now domesticating the world and setting up institutions. So you now have the state as an institution which governs the ancient civilizations of China or India or Egypt or wherever it is. You have written codes of law. You have officials. You have bureaucracies. You have religious books. You have money. You have markets. You have taxation. You have people grouped together in large conurbations, i.e. Cities. You have settled agriculture. You have a class or caste system of stratification. You have advanced crafts. You have writing. And these civilizations which emerge 10,000 years or so ago, very early now, as we're discovering in China and also the Middle East and India and so on. These civilizations begin to divide. And so you have politics and power as a separate area, and you have the economy as an instituted process, as Polanyi describes it. In other words, markets and money and all sorts of a separate area of economic activities and a separate area of political ones. So that's the formal external world. And then you have the other two areas, religion and the family, are also much more separated off. And this is the long period of civilizations and agrarian civilizations, which continues through until, most people would say, until modernity emerges. There's arguments about when modernity emerges and what it is, of course, but basically it goes on from 10,000 years ago until, shall we say, on the whole, very recently, last few hundred years. And that's the world in which you find much of the folk literature that you find in those kinds of countries, in continental and Celtic countries, they are civilizations or on the edge of tribalism, as in Scotland and Ireland. And here you find the folk literature which leads to the fairy worlds and so on. You have a big divide between the illiterate peasantry and ordinary people and the small educated circle. And the fairy stories and folk literature which emerge in Germany and France and many other parts of the world are a product of that civilizational phase. Now, that is a world where you're not yet getting the divisions between childhood and adulthood that I talked about in my own experience. That emerges in the new kind of strange civilization to which I've devoted much of my life's work, which is modernity. And this I define as the final separations between the political power, the ideological, religion and thought and ideas and so on, and including art and certain aspects of culture and language, the economic, the transactions, the manufacture and consumption of goods and trading of them, and the social, both the social stratification, social mobility, and the social entities like the family and associations and so on. And those in my world, in Britain, are artificially held apart. An individual contains all of them, all parts of them, but they are the sole receptacle of political power. I am free to vote for who I like and have my own political views, and I am a sole political actor. I am free to believe in what I like, which God I want to follow, and my ideological world is my own. I am a single economic transactor on the market, and I can follow that as I like. And socially, I am separated off. And in this world, the transition from childhood to adulthood is one where you gradually separate these off. And in the English tradition, importantly, you move from childhood, where you are embedded, as Polanyi calls it, within a social, economic and other unit, to one where you are disembedded. And that is the pain through which Wordsworth and others went. And my view is that children's stories are written in England by adults who have gone through that, and then later in their lives they go back and try to re-enter that world through various devices, through portals, through a wardrobe or a rabbit warren, through the suspension of time and space rules of adulthood, so you can fly or you can do things you can't do as an adult. And they create a simple and innocent world of often black and white, good and bad, and return to a lost innocence. And if you read the autobiographies and accounts of people like C.S. Lewis or Roald Dahl or others, they often explicitly say this is what they are about. They had often an unhappy childhood or loneliness, and they grew apart from the people they loved. They realized that they were on their own, and the pain of this led them to create a world which joined things together and made sense of the world. So this is a theme which you find very strongly, obviously, in romantic poetry as well, as I mentioned. And it's the defining characteristic. So if you look at the huge success of Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or Alice in Wonderland, it appeals to children, obviously, because they are in that world. but it appeals to adults like myself and others as much because we were part of that world. We are no longer, but rather like science fiction or historical fiction or even novels, it takes you out of yourself into another reality, and it has huge memories, echoes, and stirs up those things. So I think that English children's stories are a very good indication of some of the peculiarities of the English, and are like the other things about the English, like games. They tend to spread very successfully as the world becomes more like certain elements of the West, capitalist, individualistic, and so on. And along with it, spread the games and the stories. So that's the theme of what I want to talk to my Chinese audience.